Welcome back, everybody, to Joshua's Magic. We have a special guest today, Michael Galloway. He's a lifelong student of the Ageless Wisdom. He just recently finished a Master of Arts in International Relations and Diplomacy. Did I get it right, Michael?
Yeah, that's correct, yeah.
And he's currently working at the Lucius Trust. So, got all these things waffling around. We'll talk about spirituality and international relations and who knows what else. But so you just recently finished up this degree. What was that all about? What can you tell us about international relations now? You got your special hat and your scroll.
Yeah, well, I mean, international relations is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It deals, foremost with the relations, usually at like a government-to-government level, between two countries. The field of international relations, though, is much broader. It encompasses, international law. It encompasses, military relationships. It encompasses economics. Pretty much anything that has to do with global relationships, global governance, even at a local level, is increasingly kind of pushed inside of the field of international relations. From more of an academic standpoint, they have these sort of overarching theories of how, how state-to-state relationships work. And
so what are some of the theories?
So like,
some of them may be popular or somewhat known to the average Joe, and some of them may be quite arcane.
Yeah, well, for instance, like a lot of people in the US especially, when they think of, foreign relations with other countries, they usually think of it in terms of like, hawks versus doves, whether somebody's going to be more, coercive or more more pacifist. But on, the academic study of international relations, that's not really a dichotomy that's used. There's a lot of different theories, but there are really three main theories. And the first one is, I'll just say what they are. They're realism, also called neorealism, liberalism, and constructivism. The first one, neorealism, or realism or neorealism, is really what most people think of when they think of like realpolitik, which is kind of like, the world is an anarchy. There's no international police like above the level of state governments, like country governments. There's nobody to really enforce the law. We have international law now but there's nobody to really and truly enforce it. And so what that means is that states must always be suspicious of other states, and they can't truly trust anybody. And because a government's foremost responsibility is to its citizens, they must above all do what they can to protect their citizens, which means oftentimes arming themselves in case somebody does attack, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Liberalism, or what's also called neoliberal institutionalism, puts more like the individual at the center and says, how can we do what's best for the individual. It believes, unlike realism, that, this anarchic nature of the international system can be constrained by institutions. International law is really kind of the main, that because there are these international laws, because there are norms, those actually constrain the actions of states to the extent that even though there's nobody going to enforce them necessarily, states wouldn't do something like just totally invade another state at this point.
Well, unless it was a real crime.
Exactly. Well, I mean, they would argue, the international community, of course, would gang up against them. Anyway, these are all kind of pure ideas, and so everybody's gonna be somewhere in reality, somewhere in between all of them.
Yeah.
And the third one is constructivism, and essentially says that anarchy is what states make of it. That the way states think about the international system is the way that system is constructed. So what that means is that state identity plays a large role in state relationships, and also that but also that anarchy can be constrained, that international relationships can be beneficently constructed if states change the way they see each other and the way they see themselves in relation to each other. So those are really the three main theories, and what you're going to find is in most conversations about international relationships, you're going to see a mixture of all these things.
But are there like people that are hardline for one theory or another, or is it?
Yeah. I mean, if you want to see like the U.S. during the Cold War, for instance, I mean, also kind of, but especially the U.S. was really very, very realist. You know, the idea, this whole domino theory. You know, if we lose one country to communism, they're all going to go.
Yeah.
That's kind of based in a sort of realist paradigm. Henry Kissinger is kind of a quintessential realist. If you know who that is.
Henry Kissinger, yes.
Yeah.
The famous statesman from the Nixon administration.
Yeah, and he was actually an academic. You know, he was a university professor and a scholar before he became Secretary of State. And so those theories, which were very prominent at the time, definitely influenced his foreign policy and therefore the foreign policy of the United States.
Well, what do you think about that theory now that we've gone past that time period a ways, the domino theory?
Yeah. So, you know, once the Soviet Union fell in the late 80s, things really changed. You know, there wasn't really anybody out there that could truly challenge the US's hegemony. And so I think what that means is that you didn't really see, I don't know, realist thinking it didn't go away, but it just wasn't so important necessarily. It wasn't so vital. Like there weren't really any truly vital threats.
Yeah. No, sorry, what I meant was in the, you know, with 2020 hindsight,
Mm-hmm.
or as good hindsight as we have now, do you think that was an accurate or mostly accurate assessment of the domino theory of that time period? That you can't let this country fall because then, you know, the others are going to fall. Or what's your analysis of that?
Well, it's really difficult to say. I can't say definitively, you know, what it is, but
do you have any
whether it was good or not because I wasn't there. Mm-hmm. I know like the whole, you know, U.S. and Soviet relationships are mostly overarching all of the relationship was, you know, first of all, this whole domino theory thing, but also the threat of mutually assured destruction, which was that each side both had nukes. And, you know, if one side used nukes, the other side would retaliate and we both just blow each other up.
Yeah.
Basically. So the threat of like mutual nuclear annihilation was very, very real in the sense that, you know, today it's still possible, I guess. But back then it was very very, very, very like, there's a sense that it was very imminent. So in that sense,
and they prepared people, you know, in school, you had to hide under your desk because if a nuke hit, you might survive if you were under your desk.
Yeah, he probably wouldn't, but clearly. But yeah, so it's, you know, it's hard to tell. It's hard to say, you know, whether it was, you know, in one sense, I'd like to say, you know, clearly, no, it wasn't. Mm-hmm. You know, Vietnam, it didn't really work out for us very well. And it was okay, actually. In the end, like, it didn't really matter that much that, you know, Vietnam became communist. So I would say it was totally overblown, but I think U.S.-Soviet strategic interaction, it was definitely like a real thing. Realism was definitely warranted during that time, I think.
Nukes going on.
But yeah, I mean,
have you? Go ahead.
The whole thing. I was going to say the whole thing about realism, though, is that, you know, you can't cooperate because you'll never know what the other side is going to do. You know, and that's totally wrong. In one sense.
Oh, there's no real space for cooperation in realism.
Not really. I mean, the theory is more complicated. You know, I'm oversimplifying it, but you know, we cooperate with people who aren't threats, basically.
Who aren't?
Who are not threats, yeah. Who aren't perceived as threats.
Yeah.
But, you know.
So like Australia, England, United States under realism wouldn't have a problem cooperating, but you know, China or Russia, you know, it wouldn't. They'd be perceived as threats or potential threats, and then it would.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah. Well, I was about to say something, I forgot what it was. Oh, it's left me. But
Well, I wanted to add, piggyback on the idea of MAD, mutually assured destruction. If I assume you've heard of this concept, mutually assured economic destruction.
oh yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
that's a real thing for sure. Yeah.
And I guess, was it after World War II that this started? They were like, you know, we've had all these wars, and you know, we don't want, you know, wars anymore. So we'll have sort of the economy is all sort of interconnected, so that, you know, it's not about launching the nukes. It's now like, well, if you go to war, then you're going to get, you know, screwed over because your economy is tied into this person's economy, and it's going to mess everybody up.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if that was the reason for the whole, global interconnected economic system. I think that just happened.
Well,
I don't think anybody planned that. I think it was just happening just because of the way that technology and trade and the benefits of trade in general.
it may have coincided, and there may have been more than one thing going on, but I could be wrong, but I seem to remember hearing about that this was a theory that people were trying to implement, even if there were other streams and it happened.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it's a good justification for it, like a good way to support that. But I think it was going to happen anyway.
Yeah.
Even without that argument.
Yeah, but we're seeing sort of the downside of that with this whole situation with COVID-19 and China and stuff.
The downside of globalism, of interconnected global economy, you mean?
Yeah, mutually assured economic destruction.
Yeah.
And you know, I what would you call it? Like boundless interrelations or no limits interrelations, something like that. I guess, you know, the only limit is whether it's profitable, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about this mutually assured economic destruction is that it works both ways. So, in the sense, it makes people kind of work together.
Yeah.
So it's kind of just a constraint, I don't know if it really is good or bad. It's just one more constraint that states have to work within. I think it's probably, I don't know a whole lot about it, but I think, I don't, yeah, I'm not an economist.
Well, yeah, I mean, but it's a pretty simple
thing.
I mean, it's just that everybody's connected now, and you can't, I mean, that's the problem with connections. Like, you know, if somebody gets, you know, messes up over here, then it's going to affect you over here.
Yeah. I mean, looking for more of a spiritual perspective, because, going to get this degree actually was inspired by my spiritual work. That's why I wanted to engage with this sort of more sort of mundane explanation of international relations. But yeah, I think the whole interconnected thing is a definite spiritual impulse, and I think it's unavoidable at this point.
Yeah.
The reality that humanity is not only interconnected, but actually part of one whole, has been a spiritual reality since forever. And I think it's just working out onto the physical plane, you could say, or the plane of human relationships, the human plane.
Do you think there's and I'm just looking for your personal opinion or perspective here. Do you think there's the possibility of jumping the gun with that? Like, you know, there is this, you know, oneness on a deeper level, and like you say, manifesting in the world and leading to greater connection. But is there ways that it can be overshot or done in sort of a corrupt way that doesn't sort of truly line up with the principle?
Yeah, it could be done in a corrupt way, but in terms of just like the whole concept of this whole interconnected economy thing, economy isn't really good or bad. It's just the nature of that system that we're connected is an opportunity. I mean, I guess there's some way it could be taken. I mean, anything could be,
Because I sort of see it like this, and feel free to push back, of course, but there's a sort of, the idea of global connectedness and the one humanity, and that's a real thing, and it exists on a deeper level than the physical level, and it slowly manifests into the physical world, like we've been saying with the internet and the economy and all sorts of other stuff that's gone on over the years. But I guess the thing is when the connection gets used for nefarious ends.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's the ideal of like, the interconnectedness is a good thing. But if, I don't know, I mean, you could just take obvious examples with the internet. Like, I guess most people would say the internet's a good thing because look at how it's brought people together and freed up things and given access to stuff. But along that same venue, there's like, well, now like terrorists can organize things and child predators can like, share information and do all this other stuff too. So it's like the things that are positive can also be used toward negative ends.
Yeah, of course, but I think the benefits far outweigh the negatives. I mean, yeah, there's this, yeah, I mean, any sort of systemic change is going to be used by anybody
Yeah.
for whatever end that their intentions are directed.
So I guess it then comes down to the devil in the details, like any specific connection or setup. If that thread is actually vibrating to a spiritual principle, or if it's a corruption of a spiritual principle.
If the what's vibrating at a spiritual?
The connection or the thread.
Oh, the connection is, yeah.
So like the principle of connection can be applied in good and in bad ways, but that interconnection is ultimately a divine principle.
Yeah, I mean, it's a systemic constraint. So it's almost like, in one sense, I mean, sort of in a symbolic sense, it's like above the level of humanity, and we just have to work within it.
Yeah.
It's not technically, but in a sense it is. And I think that just shows this sort of, but it was human created also. It's not like it came from some spiritual levels. That spiritual impression on humanity, which we know is constantly coming in, that is what inspired humanity to create this sort of system. And I think anytime you have this sort of spiritual change or any type of big change like that, it's going to be very, very conflictual. And I don't think there's any way to do it without conflict. I think you have to have conflict.
It's definitely gonna.
And yeah, it has. I mean, yeah. Anytime you have some sort of spiritual evolution, anytime there's any sort of moving forward, there's going to be this sort of clash between the good and the bad, between the light and the dark. It's kind of a mythological thing, but it's also just sort of a. It also happens in practical ways as well. So,
what are some examples you've seen of that or thought about?
I mean, just like the partisanship in the U.S., for instance, I feel like, whatever you think our economic and social system should be next, it's clearly not what it used to be.
Mm.
It's clearly going in a direction that's like revisionist, which means it's different than the past. And
isn't revisionist not different than the past, but pretending the past is different than it was? Like revisionist is where you
maybe it can. I think it can mean that. Usually in international relations, revisionist is.
Oh, it means something else.
It just means something slightly different. But yeah, I shouldn't use that word. But yeah, anyway, it's going to be different than in the past.
Yeah.
It's changing. And it's creating all this conflict because it's like the nature of the change is so contested. I mean, honestly, I don't really know what either side, it's hard to tell exactly what it's going to be also, There's the extremes, and you get a sense that those are maybe some sort of prototypes, probably isn't going to land at either of them. But the fact that they're so far apart, it just creates all this conflict, but I think it's a good thing. I think it's going to propel us forward. Ultimately, the conflict will, if we don't destroy ourselves first, as long as we stay unified at some level.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the thing is to acknowledge. I mean, this is my take, is like to acknowledge the differences and not paper over them and, have real arguments or debates or conversations about them. Because, some things it's like, well, one of these things is right if you're talking about some specific issue, right? Even if in some other situation, the other thing might be right. But, when you get to more detailed specific things, it usually is there's one right thing or a righter thing anyway. But, so it's like holding that reality of like, differences, separation, sort of mental view of things, or intellectual maybe. And then, but also realizing that there are things that are the same or in common. And I don't know, I guess, it's, for me personally, something to wonder about. Like, how important is it to sort of make your point to somebody or convince somebody of X thing, and how important is it to sort of, in a sort of interpersonal way, sort of build, social things or nice feelings with that, right? It's like, which is the more important thing in any situation? Because you can definitely find examples where, making your point about whatever issue is much less important. That shirt doesn't match, objectively with the color aesthetic of your pants, and I've got to point this out to you because you need to know this thing. It's sort of a silly example, but it's like, there's one where it's like, your interpersonal thing with somebody is much more important than this, issue of, color matching or whatever.
Yeah, and I think that what you talk about, when you're literally talking to a person about an issue, that's really at a individual or at a local level. And I think that's where a lot of world problems in general are going to be solved, actually, at local
Yeah,
level.
I mean, especially on TV shows and the news, especially when it's not long form, like when it's like a segment on the news and it's like somebody said, I heard somebody talking how they would go on these, cable news shows. I forget if it was Fox or CNN or what, but it was like, you had like a 3-minute segment with like 4 other people, So how much time did you have to make any sort of point or elucidate any kind of idea? But yeah, I
just
definitely,
like sound bites.
Yeah,
Just positions. People just share their positions. That's all. Yeah.
But that doesn't really lead to anything good. It's like, if you're talking about like finger painting or like, pre-K stuff, you can have like, one sentence, there it is. But you need to have something that's wide enough to encompass with some valid amount of detail, whatever the issue is.
Mm-hmm.
But I think this, like you say, talking one-on-one interpersonally can really lead to something. Because you can respond to what somebody says. You can, go back and look at, the evidence you thought you had for it and see if it's really valid or not. And there can be a sort of a synthesis or an alchemy working out of what's the right thing if both people are focused on that.
Yeah, and also you're talking to a human being instead of an ideology. It's easy just to demonize an ideology, but then when you're speaking to a human being, you say, "Oh, this is a human being." I wonder why they think like that. So different than how I think. So then you come to some sort of. I mean, I could just imagine, like, what if, regardless of who wins this election, if they instituted some sort of like national initiative in the US, I'm thinking, where at local levels, people were meeting together from different sides of the political spectrum just to talk, Well, that becomes like a common thing all throughout the country. I wonder how much our thinking and our norms in this country would change. How different things would be if we had some sort of national level platform to just talk to the other side.
It hasn't gotten that much popularity, but there is something it used to be called Better Angels, and now I think it's called Braver Angels. Have you heard of this?
I think so. It's like a committee that does just what I said, basically.
Yeah.
Or organization. Yeah.
Yeah, and they're not as popular. It's not like everybody knows about it, but they've done a fairly large number of events that does similar stuff to what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think those things are pretty good. I mean, I don't actually know much about it myself, but
I'll have to look them up. It would be great to know more about them, maybe to volunteer with them here or something if I have the time.
That would be neat.
I think that's really what's needed, honestly, is that sort of thing.
Because it's funny, like the media and sort of just these, I don't know what you would call them, like sound bites or short ideas, propaganda, memes, whatever. It's like somebody's like, "Oh, build the wall," and the other person's like, "Don't build the wall."
Yeah.
So it's like if that's the extent of the conversation, how do you get to some sort of understanding or reconciliation? But
Mhm.
if you can actually talk about, well, why do you think there needs to be a wall? And it's like, oh, maybe I didn't think of that, or maybe there's another way to do that without that, or, and you can sort of bridge that gap, or work towards.
Yeah. It's interesting that the way the media works nowadays is I feel like it's, in one sense, it creates public consciousness, but I still feel like it's more of a reflection of public consciousness. And I think a lot of it has to do with the way our online algorithms work. The things that have become most popular are the things that get the most clicks. And there are a lot of people, in the news media who write more along unifying lines, even if they take one position or the other. They try to bridge those gaps. Still, there always have been and there still are. But I feel like the top articles that I see on my my Apple News or on my Facebook feed that people are sharing, they're all the ones that are just totally, you know, divisive. And because that's just the ones that are most popular. They're getting shared the most. And so it's kind of like a self-perpetuating sort of machine, I think.
There's also, I think there's some weird thing with the sound. Like if we talk at the same time, it creates a feedback thing. But there's this sort of other thing. So there's the old guard media, traditional media, right? Like the newspapers and the television stations and stuff like that. And I guess magazines too.
Mhm.
But, and that's largely dying because people are, going to the internet for everything, whether it's Facebook or YouTube or, other things. And so what sort of happened is, and this is relatively recent, but like Facebook and YouTube used to be a lot more free. Like people were just gonna, post what they were gonna post. And what sort of happened is these tech companies started promoting what would you call it? Authoritative sources. So they, instead of just whatever most accurately fits what the person searched for, they rank like ABC, NBC, the New York Times, whatever they've deemed are, it's basically the old guard media, like, hasn't died because now the tech companies have sort of artificially brought them in to put them in people's faces more. Whereas people are actually looking for other sorts of things, and they're sort of being guided back into looking into the sort of the gatekeeping institutions.
That may be the case to some extent, but I think those old guard media things, they wouldn't be dead right now. I think a lot of people still watch television, for instance. They're big networks, so yeah. I mean, a Facebook maybe, you may critique Facebook for doing that, but I don't think it's perpetuating those organizations. I think they're still relevant because people still.
Well, I mean, I'm not saying they would go away right now or they'd be totally gone, but a number of them have gone belly up because of this, and their sort of power base is going away more and more. I mean, just like cable. I mean, cable's not gone, but how many people are watching Hulu, Disney Plus, Netflix, yada yada, instead of cable? I mean, I don't have cable. I have cable internet, but I don't have cable TV.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just this interesting phenomenon of like, you get outside of the box of entrenched institutions or the sort of, you haven't heard of this concept of the GIN, have you?
The GIN?
Yeah. So it's an acronym for the gated institutional narrative. And it was coined by Eric Weinstein. And it's basically this idea of there's this sort of narrative that the institutions hold. And it suits their position. It suits sort of the status quo, right? And things that are outside of the GIN, the gated institutional narrative, need to be ignored or explained away or something. And this is sort of the thing that happens with, all organizations have this tend towards, once they've made it, shutting the door behind them and, holding on to their power.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I mean, it's sort of like, with nations and stuff. Nations aren't like, oh, let's have some new thing come along, which is going to disrupt my control over this or that.
Yeah, definitely. That's I can see how that's true, but at the same time, there's a balance. There's always going to be the old and the new, and there's going to be a transition between them. So,
Yeah.
In one sense, you could say that's just sort of the conservative, not conservative left right, but just conservative in terms of their news source is institutional, and the progressive is totally independent, people making their own news, exposing stories, whatnot, or whatever. But you really can't have the extreme of either. You have to have a good balance of both, I think, because if you go totally outside of institutions, you have no credibility. For instance, academic institutions, the whole idea is that everything is peer reviewed. Somebody just published an article, they could have a PhD, they could have good credentials, but until it's been reviewed by a board of their peers, and until the wider community has had time to respond to that theory, it's not really legitimate,
Yeah.
And also that, in academia, that everybody's work is embedded within what's already there.
Yeah.
So there's never anything that's just like, oh, everything is totally wrong and here's something new. It's like, okay, so here's what's out there. Here's what I think about it. And here's some new way of looking at that,
Well,
and this is why it's true,
I don't want to get too far into
here's my logic, here's everything. So,
I don't want to get too far into academia and stuff because I'm not such an expert on that, and I assume.
Oh no, yeah, I'm just saying there's a parallel between print media.
No, I'm not trying to cut you off. I was going to make a point about it, but I just wanted to make it clear that I'm not looking to go all the way down this rabbit hole. But another thing Eric Weinstein has talked about is there's actual real problems with peer review. Like peer review is supposed to do something like you said, but what happens is it also winds up becoming this sort of gatekeeping thing that doesn't allow new thought to come through. And I forget exactly the arguments he had for it, but he's much more familiar with it than I am. And on the flip side, if the sort of ideological narrative, the sort of status quo narrative of academia has a sort of not scientific outlook of like, let's test things and let's examine stuff, but sort of a religious or ideological point of view, then things can just be put out there that don't make any sense at all. So I don't know if you're familiar with this, but James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose and Peter Boghossian were these academics who created a series of, I don't know what you would call them. Like, they weren't done as a joke. They were serious, like a serious experiment or test. But they made up these papers that were like nonsense. But they agreed with sort of certain narratives that academia had latched onto. And so they put these in peer-reviewed magazines, and they just all got greenlit.
Yeah.
Like some of them were just like really silly. Like, go look them up. One was about like the rape epidemic among dogs in dog parks. And if you read through it, some of it is just like total nonsense. They took Mein Kampf and like stripped out like, certain words that would identify it as Mein Kampf and like switched them out for other things and then just put it in there like, all right, great, let's put it out there. And so it's like, that's just some of the flaws with peer review. Like, it can be this gatekeeping establishment, so it doesn't even allow new ideas that are worthy of thought through. And by the same token, it can become ideologically biased and just put out ideas that anybody would say were silly on its face, but they get through because the I guess academic immune system is favorable.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true to an extent. I don't know about this instance you brought up with this example, but there are there are a lot of academic journals out there, and some of them are more reputable than others, definitely. So there are some articles that I know people work their whole lives to get published in, and they are very, very, very selective in what they publish. And it's just because, it's not even because of ideological necessarily, it's because it has to be like a really, really good article, basically. Yeah. There is, and I'm not an expert on science clearly, but there's a biography of David Bohm. Have you heard of? I think it's on Netflix or some of these streaming sites.
I may have heard that name, but I'm not.
Or maybe it's on YouTube actually. Anyway, David Bohm was a scientist, and he had some sort of theory. it was about like general relativity or quantum mechanics or something. I don't know anything about it, but so about one of those things that was very different than the paradigm at that time, and it was totally theoretical. It was a theoretical thing, and he was basically like shunned by the community because they just didn't want it, because like you said, it was like an ideological, you know, whatever. He did publish it, but they basically did everything they could to disprove his theory. They couldn't figure out how to disprove it, so they just ignored it. He was kind of like ostracized from that section of academia or science community, whatever it was. But many, many decades later now, his studies are being rediscovered, and people are putting a lot more value.
There might be some validity to his theories, you're saying?
Yes, they're saying there's a lot more to his theories. So, I mean, in that sense, the peer review kind of does work because, you know, it was published. People tried to rebuke it. They did, but it stayed around, and now because it's a good theory, people are saying, oh, I think this is a good theory now.
Oh, so he was able to get it out.
Yeah, I mean, he's dead now, but I think he's dead. Yeah. Pretty sure he's died. Yeah, he died in the 90s. Yeah, I think so. Just checked.
So you sort of alluded to earlier possibly an interesting story of what led you to go down the path of learning about international relations.
Mm-hmm. Would you like me to talk about it?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I was a professional dancer in my first career. I have an undergraduate degree in dance performance, and I spent 7 years performing with ballet and contemporary modern dance companies all throughout the US, mostly on the West Coast. During this time, and pretty much, actually it was like immediately after graduating from school, I had my first job, very difficult time. And I found this sort of, you could say, spiritual group. It was called the School of Metaphysics in Oklahoma. I started meditating with them, and they kind of pieced together a lot of different like religious ideas like reincarnation, you know, Buddha's Eightfold Path, other, you know, a lot of those types of ideas, you know, the, what's it called? The astral records, Akashic records, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. I found it very interesting. And while I was there, I heard about this book by Alice Bailey. I read this book by Alice Bailey, and I ultimately joined the Arcane School, which is a meditation school and a school for esoteric philosophy, meditation, and what they call discipleship living, which is just basically living a spiritual life, living at a high level of spiritual consciousness in the modern world, and doing whatever your profession is, but doing it in such a way that you are serving the good in whatever you're doing. And so I've been a student of that school since 2012, so that would be a little over 8 years now. And that school, through deepening my studies of that philosophy and of that discipline, I realized I wanted to expand my mind in such a way that I understood the way the world works, and the way that sort of the unique place that humanity is at right now in its spiritual evolution. And I pondered a long time about how could I sort of break into a deeper understanding of this. And ultimately I decided, well, international relations is a very consequential discipline. I'll go study that. And so I did about 2 years ago, and I just graduated this summer. Yeah.
So what were some major revelations you've gotten from it? Yeah. Did it accomplish the goal? Did it broaden your perspective? And
It definitely did. It gave me a lot of technical details. It helped me see things from a much more pragmatic point of view, which I think is really, really important for anybody that's on a spiritual path and is looking at world problems. I think it's important to be both a very extreme idealist and also a very extreme pragmatist as well. So you have to really kind of reach far in both directions. And I think that program helped me become very pragmatic, whereas my studies with the Arcane School helped me to become very much helped me to remain an idealist. I think a lot of people, when they go into a program, you know, of an academic study of international relations, they become sort of very pessimistic or cynical, or, and I think a lot of people that are in government become very cynical as well after many years. And it's just because the day-to-day reality of government to government relations is kind of difficult. It's kind of problematic. There's, you know, goodwill is largely, it's easy to not be able to see the good that's happening, because a lot of that good, I think, is at the local level. It's the human to human interaction. At the international level, there's still a lot of realpolitik.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think one of the biggest revelations I've had in terms of that has really been, I'm trying to think of how to frame this, that not that it doesn't matter, but that what really matters is the consciousness that we bring to a problem. And that sounds very kind of a little,
Why don't you,
whatever. But
that's sort of an ideal. How would you ground that for people in their understanding?
I think what it is when you really see the world differently, and when you are able to act and think within that different paradigm, then it fundamentally kind of brings that paradigm into existence, and people sort of latch onto that. I think there are actually very few people in the world, perhaps nobody actually, who can think totally for themselves, in which I mean that they're totally free from the ideas, thoughts, prejudices of humanity at large. You know, to be totally free of that, totally uninhibited, I think is just sort of beyond human capability. But I think we are able to, you know, shift into a paradigm that is sort of been safeguarded for us in the spiritual traditions for a long time. And I think there is currently underway a process of sort of mediating that into existence. People are beginning to think in terms of, and it's not just, you know, think in terms of goodwill, think in terms of the whole. It's, you know, how can we look at conflict in a different way? You know, how can we look at the underlying causes of conflict, you know, not in terms of historical grievances, in terms of the embattled ideologies. You know, a lot of conflicts, for instance, is just people not getting what they need on a very basic level, or what they perceive they need.
Yeah.
And there's ways of, you know, changing the paradigm of how you look at a conflict actually can change the way you solve it. And this is what a lot of conflict mediation does, is they sit down with both parties and they just basically discuss the conflict. They say, okay, what is the conflict? Here's what it is. How do you guys see it? How could we see it differently? You know, it's not even trying to solve it at first. You just try to get people to see it, and to see it in a way that it's not just, you know, me versus you. You know,
Yeah.
see it for what it really is, basically. And I think that's, and all of, you know, we think of this sort of spiritual work in terms of idealism, but I think a lot of it's actually just in terms of seeing what's really there, seeing in terms of truth, seeing in terms of like the reality of things.
Yeah.
You know, you know, at the trust in the Arcane School, we do this meditation at the full moon called Letting in the Light. And it's a very deeply spiritual meditation. The full moon is a very deeply spiritual time. And really the whole effort of spiritual work from one perspective can be defined in terms of light, in terms of letting light in. It's the light of intellect, of course, but also the light of just reality itself. You know, the light of God immanent, the light of the soul. I'm a little blabbering now, but
Yeah, well, that's sort of it's hard to convey it to somebody that hasn't experienced it. But this idea that energies from meditation or from spiritual contact can actually change situations on the physical level. Like I'll just speak, you know, going to some full moon meetings. You know, you come out of there with a new outlook on things, or there's a new energy working. And, you know, some are better than others, but it's not the same as like, well, if I just, you know, hang around and did whatever at the same time, it would have been, you know, just as good. Like, it's that whole energy follows thought, and maybe the idea that there is spiritual energy and it can manifestly affect the world. Like, I sort of one example I go to with energy is like, if you walk into a room and like two people have just been fighting, like most people like sense like there's something off, and not just like with those people's body language. Like you can really feel that energy, and that's one of the most like sort of dense or obvious energies of like anger and negative feeling.
Yeah.
But you can see the effect that has on you, or it has on people. Like, you know, people who weren't a part of the fight, now they're there and they're like, well, you know, holding back and not wanting to say stuff. And how much can positive energy impacts affect people? And I don't think that's very, I mean, well, I know it's not very well understood. That these things, you know, we just see the outer things, like, oh, Tesla had some ideas, and Edison had some ideas, and, you know, the founders of America had some ideas, and, you know, people in Europe and Africa had ideas. And it's just like, well, they just had these ideas, you know, but where did they come from? What was the inspiration that initiated those ideas? And there's, you know, these deeper energies playing out. And like you said, with letting in the light at the full moon and stuff, if you can really bring those energies forward, you can actually, as a magician, let's say, manifest the sort of inner reality in the outer world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that goes back to consciousness, because I think what you know, they say energy follows thought. Of course, as we think, so we become. But when you're able to work from the level of the soul, you know, which is the true thinker, you know, exists on the plane of mind, really, above the intellect. It's the soul that conditions consciousness. And when the soul is, you know, when the soul is on the job, as they say, then it conditions everything below it. It conditions the way you think, and that in turn ultimately precipitates into a physical existence. Sometimes it takes a while, you know, sometimes it doesn't precipitate immediately, but it does eventually.
Yeah, it would be. I guess there are initiatives, like the Global Silent Minute and other things, of people trying to let in the light and sort of bring higher forces to bear on the world situation and world events. But, you know, you can get so into politics or current events and just looking at them at face value, like, you know, just any sort of issues, like, oh, this thing happened. How can people believe that? And, you know, even if you're technically right that people are wrong for believing the thing, just looking at it on the sort of obvious, visible appearance level doesn't necessarily bring about any sort of change, right? Mm-hmm. Because what, you know, even if it's on an interpersonal relationship, what do you say to this person? Come on, how can you whatever? You know, that usually doesn't lead to, oh, you're right. You know?
Yeah.
And but looking to I don't know, I guess the causes behind it, or what energies can be brought to bear on these things, or you know, even like you said with conflict mediation, just seeing it in a different way can in itself lead to changes with it. Mm-hmm. But it's really tempting. You know, you hear about some story, and then, you know, somebody you know thinks like the opposite opinion, and you're like, oh, well, they don't understand, and if I just, you know.
Yeah, it's because it's a level of ideology. You know, in the esoteric psychology, they have what are called the 7 rays, which are 7 archetypal types of energy. And the 6th ray is the ray of ideology and of idealism, and it's fundamentally the ray of attraction and repulsion. And so in the realm of ideology, you know, they have a constant attraction and repulsion. You can see that, you know, definitely in U.S. politics for sure, U.S. culture in general, kind of.
The U.S. is supposed to be, the personality is supposed to be on the 6th ray itself.
Yeah, the U.S. is, at the personality level, is highly conditioned by the 6th ray. which
And
means
and the
sense.
U.S.'s soul is supposed to be on the second ray of love, wisdom.
Yes, exactly, of love wisdom. So um,
So
our
we see a
task
lot
as
of
a
personality expression now, but maybe not as much
there's a lot of
soul
personality
expression as
expression.
we'd like.
But our task as a nation is to transmute that energy of the sixth ray into the second ray. That doesn't mean to negate the sixth ray totally, because it will always be there. It's sort of the mode through which our national soul expresses itself through these enlightened, ultimately through an enlightened ideology, an enlightened idealism, really. So I don't think there's really one enlightened ideology. I think that's the trick.
Yeah.
It's not about finding one ideology. It's about right relationship between the ideologies. But I think there is a sort of enlightened idealism that's possible, and an idealism that sort of affords for a diversity of thinking and a diversity of different paradigms of thinking as well. And I think that's when we realize that as a country, then we're going to get, then that second ray will be able to come down, be able to sort of let in the light. Because most people that grow up in the U.S., I think they know that at the local level there is a lot of goodwill in this country. Actually, I grew up in the South in a smaller town. That was my experience always, was that at the local level, there wasn't really this division that we see on the national scene. Maybe things are different now. That was 20 years ago or something when I was growing up.
Mm.
But there's so much goodwill in the U.S. And there's also so much repulsion, of ideologies as well.
Well, yeah, it's sort of an interesting study in the personality being, basically the emotions, mind, and the body, in esoteric terminology anyway. And then the soul is, like you say, something deeper than that, or beyond the highest aspect, which is the intellect or the lower mind.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like, if you can hold the personality, because that's the whole point of spiritual evolution, or spiritual evolution for most of us, is to unite the soul and the personality, to bring them together. And it's not about like destroying the personality and just having the soul standing in the smoking wreckage of it. It's about integrating them. And so, yeah, I liked your point about ideologies. Like you can still have an ideology. It's like you've still got the personality, but it's open enough to this sort of relationship with other people, such that you're bringing in the soul.
Mm-hmm.
That but you're still holding on to this, but you're not holding on to it so tight there's no room for the higher or the lighter to come through.
And I think it's tricky because I think there's some ideologies, if you want to call them that, modes of paradigms of thinking, that aren't really possible to be brought into right relationship, such as like if you had an ideology of racial superiority.
Yeah, the Nazis don't get along too well with other people.
Yeah, I don't see how that could be rectified. So it doesn't mean that everything's going to be okay. There is, and that's what we're trying. I think that's as a country, but also the whole world as humanity. That's what we're trying to work out right now. It's like, okay, well, how can we have diversity of opinion yet? There are some things that are bad.
Yeah.
That we should rebuke. But how do we rebuke them? What's the right way of doing that?
Well, it comes back to that judgment of like, what's the most important thing? Because if like you're in Nazi Germany, right? And assuming, I don't know, it's at a point where you can still sort of speak out about it before you're disappeared or whatever. There's the dichotomy of trying to get along with your fellow man, right, and not having a conflict about something. But in that situation, I think most people would agree, like the thing of like this Nazi thing not being good is like the most important thing, in that situation. And like, oh, I better not ruffle my neighbor's feathers, But yeah, if you don't, then maybe we're all heading to the gas chamber, whatever.
Yeah.
And so
at the beginning, where there's some Nazis who maybe thought it was just maybe there are some people that says, oh, I'm a Nazi, but it's really just, I believe in the economic policies.
Yeah.
Or something, so you're like, oh, well, is it wrong to rebuke Nazism totally? If it's just, this one person thinks it's just economic policies.
Yeah.
It's clearly not, everybody should have rebuked it, but
well, I mean,
it's so clear at the time, it's not clear.
Well, there was sort of waves of
for some people.
There was like this thing happened, and then that wave went along, and then boom, the Reichstag fire, And it's like you didn't necessarily know this was coming exactly, from the thing that happened before.
Yeah. I mean, there were signs, like if people, if it weren't for propaganda, I think probably people could have told what was up.
I mean, some people did know what's up. Like Einstein
Yeah.
got out of there really early. It was like, oh, this isn't good.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I mean,
it's clearly smarter than the average person.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
There were others too who
saw
the writing on the wall, basically.
Yeah.
But it's always that thing, and I guess it really comes down to the individual manifesting it for themselves, of exercising judgment or wisdom correctly. Of like, how important is it? Is this point important enough to sort of like try to make your case to somebody on, or is it not worth getting it into it with them? It's like, which is the most important thing? And of course, doing it in a way where you're respectful of them and you're mindful of how open or not they are to it. Because if they're not really open to what you're saying, like trying to bludgeon them with it isn't necessarily going to make any progress. But like, who is it? One of the apostles, the Christian apostles, it may have been Paul. So they were out there spreading the gospel of Christianity. And he goes to Greece. And, they were pagans. They believe in all these different gods. And I guess he was on Mars Hill. And instead of just being like, listen, you people are all heathens. And I know Jesus rose from the grave, and this is the way, the truth, and the life, and, blah, blah, blah. He thought, like, how can I reach these people? And he got to understand their culture and their religion and stuff. And they had this temple called the Temple of the Unknown God. I could be getting the story slightly wrong, so correct me in the comments if I do. But so there's this Temple of the Unknown God. And it's like, whoa, what's up with this? So then he tells them, well, look, this Temple of the Unknown God, that's the temple of Jesus. And now it's being revealed to you. And people on Mars Hill were like, oh, this is very interesting. Let's hear more about this. And so he took what they knew or what they understood already and bridged what he was trying to show them with that. And whether or not the unknown God was supposed to be Christ or the Christ principle or something like that, who knows? Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. But, I guess he was demonstrating a sort of love or understanding for somebody to actually understand where they were coming from and see, what he was trying to bring them or sell them and how it fit with what they already knew. And I guess, even if you're trying to, push certain points or certain data sets or, whatever, if you can do it in a way where you're respectful and acknowledging, where the person's coming from, even if they don't agree with you, maybe it'll just be worthwhile because the interaction was respectful or kind or understanding. Because people love being paid attention to. That somebody would actually take an interest in what they think or what's going on with them.
Yeah.
Because there's lots of superficial levels of that. Like, somebody had told me something about himself, and then I guess a month or two later, like, he mentioned something, and I was like, oh, the thing from New York? And he's like, what do you mean? And he just assumed, like, I didn't pay attention to what he said the first time. Because that's what most people do. You say something, and people don't really pay attention to it. But, it seemed to have made an impact on him that I actually, like, listened to what he said and, put it together. And so
that's like a good principle of diplomacy, remember.
What is it?
Make that personal connection and then.
Yeah, you catch more flies with honey than vinegar.
What'd you say? Catch flies with honey and vinegar?
You catch more flies with honey than vinegar.
Oh yeah.
Like being nice will get people to come on board much more easily than.
Yeah. Yeah.
I wonder if there's any way that could be manifest in the world stage more, because it's very much about force and coercion, especially when it's country to country. And like even when you have
but at the diplomatic level, they don't always work like that,
Well,
for instance, it's all strategic. So you have two options. This is oversimplification: carrots or sticks. So you could, so we have something we want, we have an objective as a country, so how are we going to get that? Well, there's really two ways. You can be coercive and use a stick, hit somebody with a stick, or you could give them an incentive with a carrot, or like an economic inducement or something, say.
Well, see, the problem with the incentives, it seems to me, is that they're always like, they're literally like sugar, not something that has like nutritional value.
Yeah.
So it's like, we're going to extract all this tax money out of our citizens and like bribe you with it, right? And then you're going to do what we say as long as we keep bribing you, you know?
Yeah.
And, you know, maybe that's as good as it gets in certain situations, but it's not really, I don't know, something more nutritious in the analogy would be to somehow elucidate how having a sort of treaty or cooperative arrangement between countries would benefit them. You know, that you can really somehow demonstrate or get that idea forward that this is going to work out really good for you or much better for all of us.
Yeah, well, that's always, I think, best. But sometimes it gets down to it. There's, you know, a big multilateral treaty, and then maybe there's one country that's not happy. And so it's like, no, I'm not happy, not signing it, but everybody needs to be on board. Okay, well, what if we build you such and such and such in your country?
Well, like, do you have any examples of what
I don't know
happened?
any examples off the top of my head, no. But you could say like, okay, well, you know, it's kind of just a way of like, okay, well, it's a very complicated thing. Maybe not everybody's on board, but okay, well, there's this one problem. Maybe there's millions, even billions of dollars involved. And okay, well, if we can spend $10,000, $20,000, even $100,000, it's one thing. Okay, it's worth it, you know.
Yeah, if it's a one-time thing.
Also, coercion. You know, the threat to use force is pretty cheap. It's actually free, you know, and that's sometimes effective, but it's only effective when you can follow it up if you need to.
Yeah.
And if you have to follow it up, it's very, very expensive.
Yeah.
To use force. People forget that, you know, they think, oh, inducements, so we're using our taxpayer money. Well, shooting a few missiles is way more expensive usually than, or even just deploying troops or, you know, not even firing the missiles.
Well, sort of one of the, I guess, pretty good examples of the sort of economic inducement not working would be with the guy in Turkey. It's Assad. No, that's Syria.
Erdogan.
Erdogan, yeah.
Yeah.
So all these migrants from the Middle East, some of whom were refugees, some of whom are not, were flooding into Europe, and the European Union said, hey, I keep thinking Assad, but it's not Assad.
Erdogan.
Erdogan, yeah.
Yeah.
So look, Erdogan, you know, you take care of these people coming through your country and don't send them on to Europe, and we'll give you X amount of money. And they kept giving him every year, and you know, that's a reasonable deal, right? But then, when was it? Was it last year or the year before? He just decided like, oh, thanks for all that money. Yeah, I'm just going to let them all cross the border now, you know? And it's sort of like, to me, that seems like one of these situations where the bribe was just like kicking the can. Like, if you could have trusted somebody in that situation, it might have been, you know, the thing to do. But when it's just, I guess it really depends on who you're bribing. You know?
Well, it just also depends on how expensive it's going to be if all those migrants come in. I mean, it could be politically expensive for him personally, like his hold on power, or if the country has a social system where they have to provide social services to those refugees, then it may be very expensive in that way as well. So you could think it could actually have still paid off in the end.
I don't know what happened with that, interestingly enough. You know, it's funny, you hear these news stories and then...
Well, he ejected Erdogan kicked everybody out. All the Syrian migrants got kicked out of last year.
There was all this border security sent down there at the time. So the EU didn't just be like, oh, well, they're coming over here. But I don't really know what the sort of upshot from all that was.
Yeah, I mean, Turkey's not part of the EU, but yeah, you mean maybe like in the...
Yeah, the border
Italy,
between Turkey
and
the EU. Yeah, Greece. Like, all these, you know, sort of forces were clamped down there when he started saying, oh, just do whatever.
Yeah.
But that's the way news stories go. You know, you hear about it, and then sometimes you never hear the conclusion. Oh, I never finished that book.
Yeah, yeah, that's true.
Yeah, the treaty stuff. If you can pay off somebody to like, especially if it's a one-time thing, then that's probably a pretty good investment, assuming the treaty or the agreement makes sense to begin with.
Yeah, I mean, also, when it comes down to it, if you know you're not going to use force, really, if the other side knows you're not going to use force, maybe it's politically infeasible. What other forms, and you know they're not just going to get along, maybe they don't want to for whatever reason. You know, what other recourse do you have actually? Especially a country like the U.S. You know, we have money, we have control of the international financial system to a degree. What other tools do we don't really have a lot of other tools. You know, we have our alliances. We can, if we band together with enough other countries, we can cut off trade to that country. But if other countries, if Europe's not on board, well, that's not going to work either. You know, we can't really put in sanctions. So sometimes a payoff is, you know.
The problem with the use of force, though, is you really, like you say, the threat is free. But if somebody ever calls you out, you really have to, make it happen.
Yeah, which means in the first place, you can't really threaten unless you know for sure you can and will follow through.
Yeah, like maybe you have a different perspective on this, but I guess it was the chemical strike.
Obama's red line in Syria.
The red line in Syria. And, the weird thing with John Kerry, and what he said about that later, but it was like we didn't stick with that red line. And the consequence of it was, oh, look, the United States isn't going to, follow the red line. And then we had Russia annexing Crimea. And it was sort of like, if you say it, like, you gotta stick with it somehow. Because as soon as, people are able to call your bluff, there goes Crimea or something else.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think even if Obama had stuck to that red line, Crimea still would have happened.
Why do you think?
Because in that instance of Crimea, I think they knew for sure the U.S. and NATO in general wasn't gonna do anything.
What's the thinking there?
It's just the calculus. Ukraine isn't a member of NATO,
Oh. Yeah, Ukraine. I mean, it's really unfortunate that they're really.
The alternative would be we'd have to use force, and nobody. It's such a huge cost to go to war with Russia. To engage militarily with Russia.
But it's. I mean, there's another precedent of a red line that was allowed to be crossed.
Exactly. Yeah, it is.
Well, but what I mean specifically was in the 90s, Ukraine had all these nuclear weapons, and it was like, hey, you shouldn't have these nukes. But guess what? What was it? England, the United States, and Russia are all going to guarantee your security if you get rid of the nukes. And then they got rid of the nukes, and none of those parties guaranteed their security. I mean, the United States and maybe England helped them out somewhat, but they definitely didn't stop Russia from taking Crimea. And
definitely not, yeah.
Yeah, and that sends the message like, oh, well, you can't really rely on agreements or international norms. Nukes, on the other hand, can keep you safe, though,
Yeah, but, yeah.
And so it's like, if that agreement had been stuck to, then it sort of concretizes, like, the law is the law, and international agreements are valid. But to the extent that that's not really the case, it sort of leads to that anarchy perspective that you're talking about, that realpolitik, like, I can't really trust people. I got to have my nukes, to keep my country safe.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know much about that agreement, but generally I think what you say is true. If they had this agreement that they were going to protect them, and now they aren't because things have changed. That's always how it is,
Yeah, it personally frustrates me, like, a lot with, like, and now I'm talking on an interpersonal level, like people lying or breaking their word and stuff. And I'm not always articulate enough to explain, like, what the problem is there, and I maybe get too upset about it. But it's like, it never ends well when somebody lies about something. And there's always, like, this excuse or, well, it's okay because of this. And it always leads to something worse down the line.
Yeah, because it breaks down that trust. I can no longer trust you.
Yeah.
And you can't really trust me, and it's over.
Yeah, I saw this quote. I think it was about cheating. It's like, I'm not, or maybe it was just about lying. But I'm not upset that that you lied to me. I'm upset that I can never trust you.
Oh yeah.
And you know, it's like your 30 pieces of silver. You know, is that worth it? Is whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is, a lot of people, that's maybe their way forward. Is like, that's how they're going to learn their lesson of, like, you know, through pain instead of taking the high road.
Yeah.
And that's something I've sort of had to accept, like the realpolitik of interpersonal relationships. Like, no, there's no convincing people of the high road sometimes, and you know, they're just going to do what they're going to do, and the best thing is to probably step out of their way.
Yeah. Yeah, ultimately, you people have sovereignty over their own decisions. You know, they're going to do what they're going to do. So that's how it has to be, you know, free will and all.
But we can always look to a greater ideal that through free will, we can bring down some of the higher qualities and principles into manifestation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, spiritual will, yeah, bringing it down. Well, Joshua, is there I'm sensing it's time to wrap it up, maybe.
I've run out of questions. I was thinking the same thing.
Okay.
but is there anything you wanted to plug before we left?
There is actually. So the Lucis Trust is holding a webinar this Saturday called Humanity in the New Fire. It's going to be Eastern time in the US is 10 a.m. to 12:30 noon, 12:30 p.m. And this webinar is just going to be a discussion about sort of the connection between some modern advances in science and esotericism, particularly what we call the fire of electromagnetic radiation. We're going to be interviewed with Lori Faro and Mintz van der Velde. Lori's a PhD, a medical doctor, and Mintz is a theoretical physicist. They're just going to talk about some upcoming new experiments that are new and up and coming, and just how that kind of relates to sort of esoteric philosophy.
Nice.
So you go to lucistrust.org to find the link to that.
Well, I'll put the link in the description of
Okay, great.
the video here, so people can check that out.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Joshua.
Hopefully
really
I'll
great.
have the video up before Saturday.
Okay.
Otherwise, maybe I'll put the link to where you can watch it after the fact.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll have it archived somewhere. So yeah. All right. Thanks so much, Joshua.
Yeah, it's been a great conversation. I really appreciate having you on. And everybody, if you like this video, hit the like button. Share it if you think other people would benefit for it. And if you want more of this content, subscribe and hit the notifications bell. Till then, for Joshua's Magic, signing off. And oh, I almost forgot. In all my interviews, I ask somebody a parting question.
Yeah.
Not unlike James Lipton's, when you arrived at heaven, what would you like God to have to say to you? No, but my parting question is, take a second and through the soul or the intuition, see what you can bring down of a message for people out there.
Oh God, anything?
Yeah, whatever it is, whatever your intuition brings forth.
I would just say, just be kind to people. I think that's the most basic advice, the most best and basic advice you can possibly, I could possibly give. Just be kind, because I think when you're kind, it just opens up an opportunity for right relationship, which is the goal.
Nice. Thanks for that, Mike.